There is a distinct, unuttered terror known only to veteran paranormal investigators. It isn't the sudden jump scare or the settling of old pipes. It is a suffocating atmosphere that overcomes someone who has spent decades exploring derelict psychiatric wards and flooded Victorian asylums with measured detachment. Suddenly, mid-investigation, they pack their gear, grab their coats, and walk out without explanation. This psychological threshold unites every location on this list. These properties have been assessed by seasoned professionals who have stood alone in medieval dungeons at 3 a.m., yet each site eventually forced an investigator to abandon their post early. Some of these 10 houses are internationally famous. Others sit quietly in rural English counties, appearing perfectly ordinary from the outside. However, our number 1 entry features a historical anomaly so remarkably specific that serious researchers have remained baffled since 1953. 10. Woodchester Mansion, Gloucestershire. Hidden deep within a precipitous, heavily wooded Cotswold Valley stands Woodchester Mansion, a striking Gothic Revival masterpiece that was never completed. Construction abruptly ceased in 1873. William Lee, a wealthy Victorian convert to Roman Catholicism, had poured the equivalent of £20 million into creating his dream estate. Upon his death that year, the stonemasons dropped their tools mid-stroke and never returned. His heir was informed by successive architects that finishing the structure would cost more than rebuilding from scratch. Consequently, the mansion remains frozen in time. Visitors walk through surreal chambers where grand stone staircases terminate mid-air, half-carved gargoyles emerge from blocks, and stone bathtubs hang precariously from exposed rafters. A solitary fireplace stands completely isolated, lacking surrounding walls or an overhead chimney. Since 1959, the unfinished estate has hosted 2 rare colonies of lesser horseshoe bats, forming the basis of Europe's longest uninterrupted bat study. To protect them, specific wings remain permanently sealed. While bats claimed the mansion, human builders stayed away. Paranormal teams conducting authorized overnight investigations consistently report a distinct psychological phenomenon. Rather than witnessing typical electronic anomalies or moving shadows, independent teams recount an identical, oppressive sensation: the acute feeling of being watched by an unseen entity that has already judged your presence. During a 2012 investigation, an heavy chair visibly moved across a draftless room on camera. The crew simply noted the event and retreated. 9. Berry Pomeroy Castle, Devon. English Heritage, the official custodian of England's most vital historic sites, explicitly details Berry Pomeroy Castle as one of the nation's most haunted ruins within its own commercial visitor literature. This is a definitive institutional acknowledgement, not internet folklore. The Pomeroy family held this strategic Devonshire land for over 4 centuries following a grant by William the Conqueror. In 1547, the estate was purchased by Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and brother to Queen Jane Seymour. At that moment, Somerset was the most powerful non-royal figure in Tudor England. However, his ambition led to his execution for felony in 1552. His descendants attempted to construct a spectacular Elizabethan mansion within the medieval castle walls, an endeavor that completely bankrupted the lineage. By 1613, the grand house stood unfinished. By 1697, it was systematically dismantled, its lead roofs melted and timber stripped, leaving a picturesque ruin. Centuries of hauntings center on 2 distinct figures. The White Lady is traditionally identified as Margaret Pomeroy, systematically starved to death in the castle dungeons by her jealous sister, Eleanor, over a shared romantic interest. The older, more ominous, Blue Lady was famously documented in the late 18th century by Sir Walter Farquhar, a prominent physician to royalty. Farquhar recorded encountering a distressed woman in blue who lured him toward a structurally treacherous section of the ruin before evaporating. Modern researchers tracking sightings note a baffling statistical anomaly. Nearly 80% of reported encounters occur during bright daylight hours rather than midnight, witnessed by unsuspecting tourists focused solely on the historic architecture. 8. Blickling Hall, Norfolk. Every 19th of May, an unsettling specter allegedly returns to the grand estate of Blickling Hall. A phantom carriage drawn by 4 headless horses arrives at the entrance, carrying the spectral figure of a woman clad in white, holding her own severed head in her lap. This date marks the anniversary of Anne Boleyn's execution at the Tower of London in 1536, after Henry VIII orchestrated fabricated charges of adultery and high treason against her. Modern historians recognize Blickling Hall as Anne's probable birthplace and the primary estate of the Boleyn family during her formative childhood years. The current Jacobean structure was erected between 1616 and 1627, built precisely upon the foundations of the original medieval Boleyn manor. Anniversary sightings along the approach road constitute a tradition stretching back continuously to 1536. Local accounts from that year describe rumors of headless horses galloping down the driveway just as news of her execution reached Norfolk. Whether these early accounts represent genuine contemporary reactions or retrospective folklore remains impossible to verify. However, the documentation of modern sightings is substantial. Every May, the National Trust quietly acknowledges the phenomenon as crowds gather outside the locked wrought iron gates before midnight, reluctant to leave the historic perimeter. 7. Ham House, Richmond. Erected in 1610 along the River Thames, Ham House boasts one of the most impeccably preserved 17th-century interiors in existence. The rooms retain an atmosphere suggesting the original inhabitants merely stepped out for a moment. According to paranormal researchers, that impression is terrifyingly accurate. The estate was governed by Elizabeth Maitland, Duchess of Lauderdale, a brilliant, calculating aristocrat who effectively co-governed Restoration-era Scotland alongside her husband under King Charles II. Contemporary accounts paint her as an incredibly ruthless politician who refused to relinquish anything she claimed. She died at Ham House in 1698 at the age of 71, having spent decades molding the property into a physical manifestation of her formidable will. The National Trust property is officially reported to harbor at least 16 distinct hauntings. Manifestations of the Duchess are frequently described as a localized, freezing drop in air pressure near her historic bedchamber. Furthermore, her pet spaniel, matching the exact breed depicted in her period portraits, is regularly heard scratching or felt brushing against legs in the long gallery, an area where live animals are strictly prohibited. One historic guide recalled a visitor complaining about the strict no-dog policy, asking why another guest was permitted to walk a small spaniel through the gallery. The room was entirely empty. Investigation teams consistently report that Ham House feels deliberately occupied rather than abandoned, creating an intense sensation of stepping into a room where everyone is silently staring at the intruder. 6. Raynham Hall, Norfolk. In September 1936, two professional photographers from Country Life magazine were documenting the grand staircase at Raynham Hall when one noticed a strange mist manifesting on the steps. He quickly ordered his assistant to fire the flash. When the photographic negative was chemically developed, it revealed a translucent, shrouded entity descending the oak stairs. Country Life published the image in December 1936. Experts from Kodak rigorously examined the original negative and confirmed it showed no evidence of double exposure or chemical manipulation. It remains the most thoroughly vetted paranormal photograph in British history. The figure is widely believed to be Lady Dorothy Walpole, sister of Britain's first Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole. She married Charles Townshend, 2nd Viscount Townshend, a nobleman notorious for his volatile temper. Family accounts specify that upon discovering Dorothy had engaged in a romantic relationship prior to their marriage, Townshend locked her within her chambers at Raynham Hall, completely separating her from her children. Official parish records state she died of smallpox in 1726 at age 39, but persistent local rumors suggested a more sinister demise. The first recorded sighting occurred during a Christmas gathering in 1835, where guests described a figure in an antique brown dress with empty, hollow eye sockets. The Townshend family still occupies Raynham Hall today, maintaining a strict policy of neither publicly endorsing nor denying the famous legend. 5. Highgate Cemetery, London. On February 6, 1970, a resident named David Farrant published a letter in the Hampstead and Highgate Express detailing his sighting of a tall, grey figure glinting through the iron gates of Highgate Cemetery on Christmas Eve. Within 2 weeks, the newspaper was inundated with correspondence describing similar entities, including a spectral cyclist and a gliding silhouette. The narrative shifted dramatically when Sean Manchester claimed the figure was a king vampire from Wallachia, imported to England in the 18th century and reanimated by modern occultists. On Friday, March 13, 1970, ITV broadcast interviews with both men. Within hours, a massive, hysterical mob swarmed the Victorian cemetery, scaling the perimeter walls and overwhelming police detachments to hunt the alleged vampire. The hysteria turned macabre on August 1st, when police discovered the charred, decapitated remains of an exhumed female body unearthed near the catacombs. Farrant was subsequently arrested in the churchyard carrying a crucifix and a wooden stake. He was convicted in 1974 for damaging historic monuments and interfering with human remains. Academic folklorist Bill Ellis later noted that the Hammer horror film Dracula A. 1972 was directly inspired by these bizarre events. Today, while the East Cemetery remains open, the Gothic West Cemetery requires a guided tour, where historians address the 1970 vampire panic as a case of modern urban folklore before continuing the historical tour. 4. Borley Rectory, Essex. Borley Rectory no longer exists. It was destroyed by fire on February 27, 1939, when the owner accidentally overturned an oil lamp while unpacking books. The insurance investigators concluded the fire was intentionally set, and the remaining ruins were completely demolished in 1944. Prior to its destruction, it was widely publicized as the most haunted house in England. Built in 1862 for the Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull and his large family, reports of disembodied footsteps and phantom bells emerged almost immediately. In 1900, 4 of the rector's daughters reported seeing the spectral figure of a nun in the Twilight Garden. The accompanying legend, of a medieval nun bricked alive into a convent wall, was investigated in 1938 and proven historically impossible, traced back to a poem by Sir Walter Scott. In 1929, the prominent psychical researcher Harry Price investigated the site, recruiting 48 volunteer observers and publishing 2 highly successful books that turned Borley into a global media phenomenon. However, after Price's death, an independent journalist exposed him for manufacturing phenomena, alleging he threw stones from his pockets. The Society for Psychical Research subsequently concluded that Price had fabricated significant portions of his data. Furthermore, Mary Ann Foister, wife of the final rector, later confessed she fabricated paranormal activity to mask an extramarital affair, admitting she wrote the famous, "Mary Ann, please help," wall inscriptions herself. Yet, anomalies remained unresolved. A young woman's skull was discovered wrapped in brown paper inside a household cupboard, and human bones excavated from the cellar in 1943 were eventually granted a Christian burial. Multiple independent witnesses with no ties to Price maintained their accounts of genuine anomalies until their deaths, leaving Borley's legacy permanently contested. 3. The ancient Ram Inn, Watton-under-Edge, Gloucestershire. Constructed in 1145 to house masons building the local church, the ancient Ram Inn was purchased in 1968 by John Humphreys for £2,600. The property proved so intense that his wife and children quickly abandoned the home, leaving Humphreys to reside there entirely alone until his death in 2017 at the age of 89. The structure is uniquely situated at the intersection of 2 major ley lines, one connecting directly to Stonehenge, the other to Glastonbury Tor. It also sits directly atop a 5,000-year-old pagan burial ground. This was verified when Humphreys excavated the earthen basement floor, discovering the skeletal remains of young children buried alongside broken flint knives. Forensic experts noted the skeletal damage was consistent with ancient ritual sacrifice. Humphreys placed stuffed toys around the basement to quiet the disembodied sound of children crying. Remarkably, the cries lessened but never stopped. The first floor, Bishop's Room, is reported to contain 9 distinct entities. 2 independent plumbers working in the room witnessed a Roman centurion on horseback manifest directly through the solid wall, later comparing notes to find their descriptions identical. Zach Baggins of Ghost Adventures described the room as one of the most hostile environments he had ever encountered globally. The property does not operate as a standard tourist site. Guests pay nominal fees to spend the night, with the majority of accounts detailing experiences that far exceed conventional expectations. 2. Chillingham Castle, Northumberland. Chillingham Castle is terrifying not because of folklore, but because of its documented historical record. Built before 1246, the fortress served as a crucial bastion on the bloody Anglo-Scottish border, utilized by King Edward I in 1298 as his headquarters before confronting William Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk. During these wars, John Sage operated as the castle's official torturer. Crippled in combat, he was reassigned to the execution vaults. Historical records indicate Sage systematically tortured and executed over 1,000 Scottish prisoners across a 3-year period, averaging 50 executions per week. His original implementation devices remain on public display. The actual medieval torture chambers are located directly beneath the current restaurant. They were permanently sealed by management after an undocumented event during an occult séance. When hostilities ceased, the English forces executed the remaining prisoners, burning adults alive in the castle courtyard. The remaining children were confined to King Edward's chamber and slaughtered. John Sage was ultimately executed by public hanging. An angry mob mutilated his digits and organs while he still drew breath. During 20th century renovations of the Pink Room, the skeleton of a young boy was discovered entombed within the thick stone wall. The severe damage to his fingernails and phalanges confirmed he had been bricked up alive. His apparition remains the most frequently encountered entity within the castle perimeter. 1. Treasurer's House, York. In 1953, an 18-year-old apprentice plumber named Harry Martindale was working alone in the cellar of the treasurer's house in York. While atop his ladder, he heard a resonant, repeating trumpet note emanating from within the solid stone masonry. Suddenly, a soldier emerged directly out of the wall beneath him. The figure wore complete Roman military attire, a plumed helmet, a green tunic, a short sword, and a round shield strapped to his left arm. He was followed by a packhorse and approximately 20 soldiers marching in pairs. Curiously, they were visible only from the knees upward until they stepped into an excavated trench where the lower legs became apparent. Martindale fell from his ladder in absolute terror, concealing himself until the cohort passed through the opposite wall. Upon fleeing upstairs, the house curator looked at his pale expression and remarked, "By the look of you, you've seen the Romans." This account contains a critical historical detail that baffled researchers. In 1953, standard academic texts universally depicted Roman legionaries carrying large, rectangular shields, scuda. Martindale, however, insisted the entities carried small, round shields and wore green tunics. Decades later, archaeological excavations in York revealed that 4th-century Roman auxiliary units stationed in the city carried round shields, wore green tunics, and utilized the exact gear Martindale described. An uneducated 18-year-old plumber had accurately described a specific historical military unit that modern academics had not yet discovered. Subsequent engineering surveys confirmed the treasurer's house was built directly over the Via Decumana, a major Roman highway out of ancient Eboracum. Martindale maintained his account with absolute consistency for 60 years, never accepting financial compensation for interviews before his death in 2014. The National Trust officially includes his account in their visitor materials, and investigators still report hearing that lone, distant trumpet note echoing through the subterranean stone. These historic locations remind us that hauntings are rarely about spirits. They are about the indelible weight of human history. These walls witnessed events so heavy, betrayals, executions, and wartime atrocities, that the emotional residue simply refused to dissipate when the lives ended. If you plan to visit any of these properties, observe one rule: pay attention to your immediate physical sensation the moment you cross the threshold. Notice whether the building feels like an empty space, or if it feels like somewhere that was already expecting you.